Hi, welcome to this Facebook Live studio dialogue at Raisina 2020. I'm Vikram Singh, and I'm here to talk to you about ASEAN and is ASEAN divided. I am joined by, to my immediate left, Lynn Kuok, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia and Pacific Security at IISS in Singapore, and by Satoru Nagao, Visiting Fellow, PhD, that specializes in India's military strategy at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
So the question before us is, how is ASEAN doing? And governance in the Asia-Pacific, modeled on an ASEAN centrality concept, how is that faring in the era of very changing geopolitics? And so I'm going to start with Lynn. China is challenging ASEAN's ability to maintain its consensus to some degree, particularly around issues of the South China Sea and security issues as opposed to economic issues where the bloc seems to be functioning well. How do you evaluate ASEAN in terms of its unity and its strategic relevance in the region today?
I think what we need to point out first of all is that ASEAN, even without the China factor, has never been a unified bloc. I think what we need to understand is that it's an association of nation states, each with rather different perceptions of where their national interests lie. So even without China coming into the fray, I think we've had difficulties in the past, and unity was more often the exception rather than the norm. We saw a display of unity in the wake of Vietnam's intervention in Laos, in Cambodia at the end of 1978. But that was a rare display of unity where ASEAN really came together and voiced a coherent position and stance on the issue. I think what we should note, however, is that China has also, through its actions, successfully exploited those differences. So even some of the more obvious examples I think that we all should know of is that in 2012 ASEAN failed to issue a joint communique on the South China Sea simply because China had leaned on its close ally and friend Cambodia to ensure that statement referencing worrying developments in the South China Sea were left out. And then in 2016, in a less well-known example, we had Cambodia, Laos, and claimants in the South China Sea, Brunei. Brunei actually joined on into this chorus of voices that said that the South China Sea is really just an issue for ASEAN and bilateral countries, but not for ASEAN as a whole. And in the wake of the South China Sea Tribunal ruling in 2016, what I thought would have been eminently sensible would be for ASEAN to say that this is an important ruling and all countries should adhere to it. But because of concerns about China's response, ASEAN failed to even reference this tribunal ruling. So I think this is rather disturbing in terms of the extent to which we can rely on ASEAN speaking as one voice on security challenges in the region.
So Satoru, do you agree that ASEAN is this fragmented over the security issues, and do you think that there's a path to finding more unity in ASEAN as it faces some challenges from China?
It is not easy to unite for ASEAN. It is not easy for the ASEAN to unite the effort because you have already mentioned that's true. ASEAN is more wider than the EU. For example, when we check the territorial area of the Indonesia, include the sea between island and island, the size of the Indonesia is same with the EU. So more diverse, more difficult to integrate the effort. That's true. But so by using such kind of situation, China has committed to divide ASEAN for a long time. That's also true, and they succeeded in some part. But recently, China's effort forced a tough situation. That's also true too, because most important key factor is the United States policy. Currently, the U.S. changed policy and more tougher policy they choose, and so it is not easy for China to divide ASEAN. This is my opinion recently.
So that's interesting. You brought in the United States here. So in terms of Lynn, in terms of China, ASEAN nations standing up to China, you see them doing it individually, but you know, where it concerns their specific issues, and sometimes you see them working together. But you have yet to see sort of ASEAN as a whole stand together in the face of opposing Chinese claims in the South China Sea, for example. Do you agree with Satoru that the U.S. position is critical to whether ASEAN finds more or less unity?
Yes, I think the U.S. does play a role. It's not the only factor that we have to look at in considering ASEAN unity, but I think it does play a very important role. And I think it's very important that the United States demonstrate its presence. It started to do that a little bit, I think, with the Indo-Pacific strategy, but I think, you know, putting flesh on the bones of that strategy has been slow in coming. So I think it can still do more. And if we look at the context within which the United States is operating, so it's been slow to respond. I think if we look at the context, what do we see in terms of developments in the region which are playing on the mind of the Southeast Asian countries? What we see is that since 2013, since the end of 2013, we've seen China actually start to build artificial islands in the South China Sea out of small rocks and reefs. You know, by the end of 2017, it had operational naval and air facilities on these features in the South China Sea. And by 2018, it was militarizing these features. Now, some naval experts say that, you know, the US could easily take out any of these features in the event of a hot war. But short of a hot war, what do we have? We have militarized features in the backyard of Southeast Asian countries. And this is definitely going to have, you know, influence over how they seek to behave vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the United States, and vis-a-vis each other, whether or not they stand united or they fall apart, because they have militarized features in their backyard. So the U.S. has, I think, demonstrated positive signs of, you know, taking more of a role in the region, but it comes in fits and starts, and I think it could afford more coherence, more commitment, more persistence, perhaps, is a good way of putting it.
Yeah, the United States has certainly been doing more freedom of navigation operations and more multilateral activities. There are a lot of minilateral ASEAN alliances and structures developing too, where there's sort of ad hoc cooperation. On the military aspect, Satoru, you look at military strategy in the region, particularly India's. Could you tell us a little bit about how you think India views the South China Sea issue and what its role is from sort of Port Blair looking that direction? And is it going to collaborate with the United States, Australia, Japan, and others to support this notion of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is sort of the U.S. strategy at this point?
For a long time, India forgot how important South China Sea is, because India is a great power in the Indian Ocean. So Indian Ocean is the Indian Ocean, I believe.
Yep.
But at the same time, South China Sea is out of Indian Ocean. So a little far from the India. So, but when India faced threat of China, South China Sea is the key. And when we check the Indo-Pacific strategy, which area is center of the Indo-Pacific? Indo-Pacific, Japan, Australia, India included in the one Indo-Pacific, but center is Southeast Asia, the South China Sea. And after China takes the South China Sea, China can go any direction to go Japan, to go Australia, and to go India. This is the center. So that is the reason the South China Sea is very important now. And India has the potential to deploy more military force in the South China Sea, because India has Andaman Nicobar Island, which is the base to deploy the force in the South China Sea. So if India start focusing on how important is Southeast Asia, how important South China Sea, India can do many things. So this is India's decision.
You want to react?
Yeah, just on India's role, I think Satoru-san actually talked about, you know, the capacity that India could bring to bear on the issue. of the South China Sea. But I think the other question, of course, is the political will that India has to actually deploy, its forces in the South China Sea. And I think while India is realizing the importance of the South China Sea in terms of its own security as well in the Indian Ocean, I think the extent of its efforts are still more limited to its own backyard, namely the Indian Ocean. If we look at its 2015 maritime security strategy, the South China Sea was clearly identified as a sphere of secondary concern after the Indian Ocean. So that might change, and I think I agree with my colleague here that it should change, but it hasn't yet changed. And if we look at India's multilateral exercises as well, with Japan, the United States, if Australia is involved, India refrains from participating. So India has been quite careful about not being too caught up in the security frameworks that the United States, in the sense of the Quad, might be interested in pushing for.
At the same time, the Quad's been elevated to a ministerial level dialogue, and they certainly discuss China's role in the region and the South China Sea, so there seems to be more coordination between those big powers.
Sure, but more from a diplomatic perspective.
More from a diplomatic perspective, I think, which is probably more comfortable for the Indians. In your opinion, so the Chinese would say, look, this is our natural area, and to many observers now, they have kind of achieved their exerting of power into the first island chain. They've sort of achieved their objective to some degree, and they probably believe that there will be acquiescence in the region to their role, including their military role in the region. And they say, but this shouldn't concern anyone. It's still free, it's still open, commerce goes on, we have no interest in disrupting any of that. How do you think ASEAN as a whole and the member states should view the Chinese position, and how do you think allies and friends elsewhere should view it? Lynn, you first, and then Satoru.
I think, I just want to caveat a little bit what you said. I think while it's true that China largely controls the South China Sea, I would say that is the case for more the territorial features in the South China Sea. In terms of the maritime space, we've seen, the United States as well as its partners, France, the UK, Australia, ply the waters of the South China Sea. And so while China's control is extensive in the South China Sea, and it certainly holds a strong hand, I think, all is not lost. So the United States and other allies and partners have been asserting maritime rights and freedom. So there is still that balance there in the South China Sea. So your question was how ASEAN should respond
to that Chinese position that don't worry, we're just doing what's natural and don't worry about it, we're not wanting to disrupt you. How should they view that? Reassurance, the Chinese reassurance.
First of all, I think that's probably quite laughable because it's quite clear that China has sent hundreds of vessels into the waters surrounding Philippines-occupied territories. For instance, this happened in the first half of last year. It sent survey vessels to conduct seismic activities in Vietnam's EEZ. When the phrase EEZ, exclusive economic zones, means it's exclusive to the coastal state. And in the case of Malaysia, it continues to maintain a near constant Coast Guard presence around Malaysian occupied features. So I think that if any of the Southeast Asian countries actually believed that they had nothing to worry about, I think that would be laughable, and I really doubt that there would be that degree of naivete. So certainly I think they're worried, and we're beginning to see instances of pushback, but I don't want to overstate that pushback because Southeast Asian countries are still very much pushing back against China, but within the limits of ensuring good relations with a powerful neighbor, as well as wanting to ensure that economic ties remain good and the various countries can prosper.
That economic cooperation is so critical. The biggest trading partner for all of these countries, of course, is China and will be for the foreseeable future. In our last 30 seconds, Satoru, are the Southeast Asian nations basically depending now on standing alone against China when they face these challenges?
Standing alone will not work. Exceptional case is Vietnam. Vietnam is very strong, but yes, most cases it is impossible to deal ASEAN countries should unite the effort, and not only ASEAN, the other countries, Japan, Australia, and most important, India and the United States should cooperate each other to deal with China. China is a big country, big threat, and China is a liar. In the past, Lynn has already mentioned, they said the artificial island they built in the South China Sea is not military purpose, but now we can see military base. So China is a liar. We need to deal with this. We should integrate our effort. That is very important.
So ASEAN centrality and unity is as critical as ever. It's highly challenged. Thank you both for a really stimulating discussion. Thank you for watching us here at Raisina 2020, and we'll see you soon.